Last week, to celebrate the beginning of the NBA's 75th anniversary season, the NBA released a list of the 75 greatest players in the history of the league. And I have to be honest with you, this list is stupid. Now, don't get me wrong, it's fun. I love talking about players and where they rank all time. I mean, heck, I am an active participant in talking about who the GOAT is in the NBA. However, can we just acknowledge how unbelievably hard and stupid it is to try and come up with a list of 75 players from the course of 75 years of basketball? I mean, just think about where the game was versus where it is now. Think about the kind of players that we had. Think about the kind of upbringing that we had for our players. It is a completely different world. And I mean, the worst part about these lists is that you're always going to see great players that are going to be left off it. I mean, just to name a few, we have Dwight Howard and Klay Thompson that were left off the list, and that's just the beginning of it. There's a ton of players throughout a ton of different eras that have a lot of legitimate reasons to believe that they should be on this list. However, in today's video, I want to talk about why this list in particular is stupid, why it's almost impossible to come up with a perfect list, and why we really shouldn't be putting a lot of our efforts into arguing it, because quite frankly, the idea of this list in the first place is just But first, if you like that, be sure to click the subscribe button on this channel. We talk all things NBA each and every day. And with that, let's get right into it. Now, the first thing that really bothered me about this list is the fact that of the 75 players on it, 50 of them are from the last list. So 25 years ago, there was actually an NBA 50th anniversary list, just like we have right now. And all 50 of those players from that list are currently on this one too. Which, don't get me wrong, that makes sense. You want to keep continuity. You don't want to really take anyone off of that list and say that they're not great anymore. But I mean, to say that after 25 years, especially with how young the NBA is and with social media, I mean, a lot of people in my generation, we don't remember these 50 players list. So how are we going to look at this list and go, okay, well, of course they have to keep the 50 from the last one? I mean, yes, we did still get modern players on this list with the likes of obviously like LeBron, with Damian Lillard is on the list. I mean, there's a lot of great players that made this. I mean, even Anthony Davis made the list. So there's a ton of great talent that deserved to be on here. However, the simple truth is it's hard to make that kind of list for anyone that's in this current generation of NBA fans, because of the fact that that means that of the last 25 years since that 50th anniversary team, we're really only getting 25 players if you think about it. So we have to whittle all of those players down and try to combine that with the original team to make a 75 player list. You're just gonna miss people out, and if you're going in right off the bat essentially really only picking 25 people, you're kind of screwed. And that just leads into the next and probably the biggest problem with making a list like this, is that no matter what, you're always going to be partial to your era. And it's important to talk about how different eras are, especially if we're going to be covering the span of 75 years. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there are times where talking about eras is an important discussion to have, and there are times where, you know, quite frankly, you could still make a good judgment call on which player was greater. I mean, for example, Michael Jordan, the things that he did in the NBA, his killer instinct, his ability to score, his Defensive Player of the Year awards, a 6-time NBA champion, to me, is the greatest player of all time. And I don't have to look at a modern era and compare how the rules have changed for me to change my mind on that. However, if we're going to look at past eras, we're going to have to be honest about some things. I've never watched Hal Greer play, and neither have you. Okay? And that's just one of the players on this list that I have no clue who this is, even as a huge basketball fan. I did do some research, and he was a 10-time All-Star. He was a member of the 76ers, and he definitely was a great NBA player and definitely deserves a spot on this list. And the other thing is that it's not his fault about how different the league was back then, because you have to consider how drastically different and how much things have evolved since the 60s and the 70s. I mean, heck, think about how players are even paid now. Dave Bing is another member on this list. He actually was the mayor of Detroit at one point, very successful businessman, but his first NBA contract was for $15,000. This guy would play in an NBA season, and then he would go be a bank teller in the offseason. That's some never hear of now. Whereas players in the modern NBA really spend their time in the offseason honing their craft, working with trainers and professionals, working on their bodies. I mean, heck, we just learned LeBron James spends $1 million a year on his body. Players back in the day were never even paid $1 million in their lifetimes for being an NBA player. On top of that, you have the system of AAU basketball. You have all the sports scientists and equipment and things that we have nowadays that was just simply not possible for players back in the day. On top of that, you have players on this list that didn't even have a three-point shot when they were in the league. How are you going to compare the greatness of some of these players who never even had a three-point shot in their game to the likes of Steph Curry, who's the greatest three-point shooter of all time? It's just not a fair argument for anybody, and to suggest otherwise is just simply stupid. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these players are great. They still deserve to be praised. They still deserve to be celebrated. But the fact is, no one's ever going to score 100 games in an NBA game again because of the fact that the rules are completely different. I mean, when Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in an NBA game, he was able to partially because he was taller than everybody, but also 50 of those points are free throws, man. And then the third and final problem of this list is that 75 is just such a weird number to argue and to whittle down to. I mean, it's just so odd. I mean, when in your life have you cared about the top 75 of anything? When have I ever gone, man, what are the top 75 restaurants I've ever been to? Man, what are the top 75 days I've ever had? What are the top 75 songs I have? It's just not a number that you're really going to ever think about. The other thing is that if you're really wanting to truly dissect and try and come up with a perfect formula of who belongs on this list, it would just take way too long, and at the end of the day, you're still not going to get a perfect result because clearly the NBA went through a really long process of having a ton of different publications, journalists, NBA personalities, and a lot of other people vote on this list, and we still ended up with the list that we have. The other thing that you have to remember about this list is that at the end of the day, this list was made to celebrate the NBA players that have made an impact on the game. This is a list that is made to celebrate players throughout eras. And so even though there are certain players that were left off, you have to realize that that was done by design to tell you about some of these older eras. It's really to give you the history of the NBA. And quite frankly, I don't think you necessarily need Dwight Howard on that list to tell it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these lists shouldn't exist. I'm not saying that these lists don't have a certain type of value. I'm just saying that if you're going to look at this list and you're going to dissect it and try to come up with who the 75 greatest players of all time are, you're already losing, because the simple truth of the fact is that this is a list to celebrate the NBA. This is a list to celebrate 75 years of basketball. This is a list of names that have meant a lot to the game of basketball, and that's all this list should really be. This should just be a celebration, because at the end of the day, we're going to forget this list exists by next week, and the only argument that we're really going to care about is who the greatest player of all time is, who the greatest teams of all time are, who our favorite players are. We're never going to look back and go, man, that guy should have made the 75th anniversary team. And the other thing is that even though we have probably another 25 freaking years until we get another list like this, that doesn't mean that guys that didn't make it this time around can't make it around then. What do you think of this list? Do you think that there are names that have been left off that you really are upset about? Are there players on there that you're really mad about having a spot? Personally, Karl Malone, so why is he on there? But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time from Half Court. Be sure to subscribe.